Colorado Territory, 1887. The mining camp of Silver Creek had been Henrik Larsson's home for 8 months, though home was perhaps too generous a word for the collection of ramshackle buildings that clung to the mountainside like barnacles on a ship's hull. At 25, Henrik had already spent more years underground than most men twice his age, first in the iron mines of Minnesota's Mesabi Range, then in the silver claims of Colorado's high country. The summer heat was oppressive even at this elevation, the sun beating down mercilessly on the exposed slopes where the trees had been stripped away for mining timber. Henrik wiped the sweat from his brow as he emerged from the mine shaft, his slight frame dwarfed by the massive timber supports that held back the mountain's weight. At 5 feet 7 inches and barely 140 pounds, he had learned early that what he lacked in size, he made up for in determination, and an almost supernatural ability to read the mountain's moods. "Another day, another dollar," muttered Pete Kowalski, Henrik's mining partner, as they trudged toward the assay office with their day's ore samples. "Though at the rate we're going, it'll be pennies, not dollars." Henrik said nothing, but privately he agreed. The silver vein they'd been following had grown increasingly thin over the past weeks. Soon they'd have to make a decision, dig deeper at considerable expense and risk, or abandon their claim and try their luck elsewhere. The assay office was a small wooden building that served multiple functions in the camp: ore analysis, unofficial bank, and gossip central. Inside, Thomas Brennan, the camp's assayer, examined their samples through his jeweler's loupe with the practiced eye of a man who had seen every grade of ore the mountains could produce. "Not your best showing, boys," Brennan announced after several minutes of scrutiny. "Maybe 3 ounces per ton if you're lucky." Pete cursed colorfully, but Henrik remained silent, his mind already working on alternatives. 3 ounces per ton wouldn't even cover their operating expenses, let alone provide a living wage. "There's talk of new strikes to the north," Brennan continued, apparently taking pity on their disappointed faces. "Indian territory mostly, but the government's been making noise about opening it up for mining claims." "Indian territory means trouble," Pete said immediately. "Ute warriors don't take kindly to white men digging up their sacred mountains." "Maybe not all Indians are hostile," Henrik suggested quietly, though he had to admit his experience with native peoples was limited to the occasional trading post encounter. Pete snorted. "You keep thinking that, Henrik." "Meanwhile, I'm going to look for claims that won't get me scalped in my sleep." That evening, as Henrik sat outside his small cabin sketching the geological formations visible on the opposite mountainside, he found himself thinking about Brennan's words. Northern Territory meant largely unexplored mineral deposits, potentially rich veins that hadn't been worked over by previous mining operations. It also meant isolation, danger, and the very real possibility of conflict with indigenous peoples who had legitimate claims to the land. But it also represented opportunity for a man willing to take calculated risks. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A lone prospector named Collins had staggered into camp after 3 weeks in the northern wilderness, his pack mule loaded with ore samples that made even the experienced Brennan whistle in appreciation. "Richest strike I've seen in 15 years, Brennan announced to the crowd that had gathered around Collins in the camp's only saloon. 20, maybe 30 ounces per ton of pure silver and traces of gold that suggest even richer deposits deeper down. Collins, a grizzled veteran of countless mining camps, held court like a king dispensing favors. "Found it in a box canyon about 4 days north of here," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the mountains. "Stream running right through the middle, good timber for supports, and enough ore showing on the surface to make a man rich." "What about Indians?" someone called out. Collins's expression sobered slightly. "Saw sign. Ute, mostly, but some Arapaho tracks, too. They know about the canyon, but seem to avoid it. Might be sacred ground to them, which could work in our favor. Indians don't usually fight over places they consider cursed." The crowd erupted in discussion, voices raised in excitement and argument. Henrik listened quietly, his analytical mind processing the information. A rich strike in dangerous territory, avoided by the local tribes for possibly religious reasons. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that could make a man's fortune or get him killed. Over the next week, Collins organized a mining expedition to his mysterious canyon. 23 men signed up, each contributing $50 towards supplies and equipment. Henrik was among them, despite Pete's increasingly vocal objections. "You're making a mistake," Pete warned, as Henrik packed his few possessions. "Collins has that look about him, like a man who's seen too much and isn't telling the whole truth." "Maybe," Henrik acknowledged, "but I can't afford to stay here. The claim is played out, and I need to make enough money to buy my own equipment, maybe start my own operation." Pete shook his head in resignation. "Then I guess this is where we part ways. I'm heading back to Denver. Maybe try my hand at something that doesn't involve digging holes in the ground." They shook hands with the awkward formality of men who had shared danger and hardship, but were not truly friends. Henrik watched Pete ride out of camp with a small pang of regret, then turned his attention to the preparations for the northern expedition. The group assembled at dawn on a Tuesday morning in late July. Collins had secured 2 pack mules and enough supplies for a month in the wilderness, along with additional mining equipment to begin immediate excavation once they reached the canyon. Henrik traveled light, carrying only his personal tools, a bedroll, basic provisions, and a worn leather journal where he recorded geological observations. The first 2 days of travel were uneventful, following established trails through familiar mining country. But on the 3rd day, they left known territory behind, striking out across country that few white men had seen. Collins proved to be an excellent guide, leading them along game trails and dry creek beds that provided cover from observation, while avoiding the worst of the mountain terrain. Henrik found himself increasingly fascinated by the geology of the region. The rock formations were ancient, twisted and folded by tremendous forces, with mineral veins that ran in complex patterns, unlike anything he had seen in more conventional mining areas. If Collins was correct about the richness of his strike, these mountains could support dozens of profitable claims. On the evening of the 3rd day, as they made camp beside a small stream, Henrik was sketching the exposed granite face of a nearby cliff when he noticed something unusual. A series of markings, too regular to be natural weathering, had been carved into the rock face perhaps 20 feet above the ground. "Collins," he called, pointing to the markings, "what do you make of those?" The older prospector squinted up at the cliff, then shrugged dismissively. "Indian markings, probably marking hunting grounds or water sources. Nothing that concerns us." But Henrik wasn't so sure. The markings were more complex than simple territorial indicators, arranged in patterns that suggested meaning beyond mere boundary stones. He made a careful sketch in his journal, noting the position and orientation of each symbol. That night, as the others slept around their small fire, Henrik found himself troubled by dreams of shadowy figures moving through the darkness, watching from hidden places among the rocks. He woke several times, convinced he had heard voices speaking in an unfamiliar language, but each time the night was silent except for the usual wilderness sounds. The 4th day brought them to the rim of Collins's canyon, and Henrik had to admit the prospector hadn't exaggerated its potential. The canyon was perhaps 2 miles long and half a mile wide, with steep sides that would provide natural protection from both weather and unwanted visitors. A stream ran down the center, providing fresh water and the possibility of placer mining, in addition to hard rock claims. Most impressive were the visible mineral veins in the canyon walls, dark streaks of ore-bearing rock that caught the morning sunlight like precious metal. Even from this distance, Henrik could see that Collins had indeed found something special. The descent into the canyon took most of the morning, following a treacherous switchback trail that Collins claimed to have discovered on his previous visit. Once on the canyon floor, the group quickly established a base camp near the stream, then spread out to examine the ore deposits more closely. Henrik's geological training made him valuable in evaluating the various claims the men staked out for themselves. The silver-bearing veins were extensive and appeared to run deep into the mountain, suggesting deposits that could be profitably worked for years. He selected a claim for himself at the canyon's eastern end, where the ore veins were narrower but showed higher concentrations of precious metal. For 2 weeks, the mining operation proceeded smoothly. The men worked in shifts, some digging exploratory shafts while others processed ore and maintained the camp. Henrik threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity, often laboring long after the others had quit for the day. The silver was indeed as rich as Collins had claimed. Even crude processing methods yielded impressive results, and the men began to calculate the fortunes they would make once they could ship their ore to proper smelting facilities. Talk turned to establishing a permanent operation, perhaps even founding a new mining town in the canyon. It was during the third week that Henrik first saw her. He had been working alone at his claim, following a particularly promising vein deeper into the mountainside. The work was dangerous, requiring him to excavate carefully to avoid cave-ins, but the ore was so rich that he felt compelled to continue, despite the risks. As he emerged from his diggings for a midday break, Henrik noticed movement on the canyon rim, directly above his position. At first he assumed it was one of his fellow miners scouting for new claims, but as his eyes adjusted to the bright sunlight, he realized the figure was far too tall to be any member of their expedition. She stood at least 6 feet in height, her broad shoulders and powerful build clearly visible even at a distance of several hundred feet. Her hair was black and long, braided with what appeared to be feathers and small ornaments that caught the light. Most striking was her perfect stillness as she observed the mining operation below, motionless as a carved statue. Henrik raised his hand in a tentative wave, but received no response. The figure continued to watch for several more minutes, then turned and disappeared from view with fluid grace that suggested intimate familiarity with the mountain terrain. That evening, Henrik mentioned the sighting to Collins and the others. Most dismissed it as curiosity about white activity in traditional tribal territory, but Collins seemed more concerned. "I told you there were Indians in these mountains," he said grimly. "If they're watching us, it means they're deciding what to do about our presence here. Maybe we should try to communicate with them," Henrik suggested. "Explain that we're not permanent settlers, just miners working temporary claims." Several of the men laughed at this suggestion, and Collins shook his head emphatically. "Indians don't negotiate, boy. They either ignore you, trade with you, or kill you. And mining on land they consider sacred is likely to get us killed." But Henrik found himself thinking about the tall figure on the canyon rim. There had been something compelling about her presence, a dignity and strength that commanded respect. If communication was possible, it might prevent the kind of violent confrontation that typically occurred when white miners encroached on tribal territory. The next day, Henrik worked with one eye on the canyon rim, hoping to see the mysterious watcher again. When she didn't appear, he felt oddly disappointed, though he couldn't explain why. On the third day, as he was examining a particularly rich section of ore, Henrik heard footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see one of his fellow miners, and instead found himself face to face with the tall woman he had glimpsed from a distance. Up close, she was even more impressive. She stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and muscular arms that spoke of a life of physical labor. Her face was strong-featured and intelligent, with dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She wore traditional buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and her long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers and small carved bones. Most remarkably, she held a rifle with casual competence, though it was pointed at the ground rather than at Henrik himself. "You dig in sacred earth," she said in accented but clear English, her voice deeper than most men's but unmistakably feminine. Henrik's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was clearly a dangerous situation, but something about the woman's manner suggested she was more interested in conversation than immediate violence. "I didn't know," he replied honestly. "We're just miners, looking for silver to support our families." Her dark eyes studied him with an intensity that made him acutely aware of his small stature. Standing next to her, Henrik felt like a child confronting an adult, though her attention seemed more curious than threatening. "You are small for white man," she observed, echoing comments Henrik had heard all his life. "Small in body, perhaps," he replied, unconsciously echoing words he had spoken before. "But I try to be large and understanding." A hint of what might have been amusement flickered across her features. "Words are easy. Understanding is harder." She gestured toward the mining operation visible down the canyon. "Your men take sacred silver, disturb spirits of this place. Bad medicine for all." Henrik considered this, then made a decision that would change his life. "Then teach me," he said simply. "Help me understand why this place is sacred. Maybe we can find a way to work here without disturbing your spirits." The woman studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face as if looking for deception. Finally, she lowered her rifle slightly. "You speak truth words, or you speak with forked tongue like other whites?" "I speak the truth," Henrik assured her. "I'm a geologist as well as a miner. I study the earth, try to understand how it was formed. If this place has special meaning to your people, I want to know why." She seemed to consider this, then made a gesture toward a large boulder that would provide shade from the afternoon sun. "Sit." "We talk." As they settled onto the rocky ground, the woman introduced herself. "I am Ayana," she said, the name rolling off her tongue like music. "Daughter of 2 bears, granddaughter of Mountain Eagle. My people have lived in these mountains since the world was young." "I'm Henrik Larsson," he replied, "son of iron miners from Minnesota, grandson of farmers from Norway." Ayana nodded acknowledgement, then began to speak of the canyon's history. According to tribal tradition, it was a place where the spirits of the earth were particularly close to the surface, where shamans came to seek visions and young warriors underwent trials of spiritual strength. The silver veins were considered to be the tears of earth spirits, precious not for their monetary value, but for their connection to the spiritual realm. "Your people dig up spirit tears, scatter them like worthless dirt," she explained, her voice carrying weight of generations of belief. "This brings bad medicine, anger from spirits who protect the mountains." Henrik listened with genuine interest, making notes in his leather journal. From a geological perspective, the canyon's mineral formations were indeed unusual, suggesting underground thermal activity that could explain why tribal peoples might consider it spiritually significant. "What would your people need from us to allow the mining to continue?" he asked carefully. Ayana's expression hardened slightly. "Nothing. Sacred ground should not be disturbed by outsiders, no matter what is offered in trade." It was an impasse Henrik had expected, but he pressed on anyway. "What if the mining could be done in a way that respected your beliefs? What if we could work here without disturbing the spiritual significance of the place?" "Impossible," Ayana replied flatly. "Your people do not understand the connection between earth and spirit. You see only metal to be dug up and sold." Henrik was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he opened his journal to show her his sketches of the canyon's rock formations, his careful notes about mineral veins and geological structures. "I see more than just metal," he said softly. "I see the story of how this place was created, the forces that shaped it over thousands of years. Look." He traced the patterns in his drawings, explaining how ancient volcanic activity had created the canyon, how water and wind had carved its current shape, how the mineral veins had been formed by heat and pressure deep within the earth. "Your people are right," he concluded. "This is a special place, created by forces that are greater than human understanding. The question is whether we can respect that while still benefiting from what the earth has to offer." Ayana studied his sketches with obvious intelligence, asking questions that showed she understood more about geology than most of his fellow miners. Her people, it turned out, had their own sophisticated understanding of the earth's processes, though expressed in spiritual rather than scientific terms. "You think different from other white men," she said finally. "But thinking different does not solve the problem. Your men still dig sacred earth, still disturb spirit places." Henrik nodded acknowledgement, then made another decision that surprised even himself. "What if I could convince them to leave?" Ayana's eyes widened slightly. You would give up rich silver for Indian spirits? I would give up silver to prevent a war, Henrik replied honestly. And because I think there are some things more valuable than money. The words hung between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to explore. Ayana studied his face with that penetrating stare, as if trying to read his soul. Your spirit is good, she said finally. But other men will not listen to small miner with big ideas. She was probably right, Henrik realized. Collins and the others had invested significant money in this expedition and had already extracted enough silver to taste real wealth. Convincing them to abandon the operation for spiritual reasons would be nearly impossible. Maybe not, he admitted. But I have to try. Ayana rose to her full height, towering over him like a mountain peak. You try to make peace. I watch from sacred places. If your men agree to leave, they go safe. If not. She didn't finish the threat, but Henrik understood. The miners were vastly outnumbered in territory where the local tribes had every advantage. If it came to open conflict, the expedition would likely be wiped out to the last man. How long do I have? He asked. 3 days, Ayana replied. Time for you to speak truth words to your men. Time for them to decide between silver and life. She turned to go, then paused and looked back at him. You are different from other whites, she said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. I hope your men are wise enough to listen. With that, she disappeared into the maze of boulders and scrub growth that dotted the canyon walls, moving with such fluid grace that within moments it was as if she had never been there at all. Henrik sat alone beside his mining claim, staring at the rich silver vein he had worked so hard to develop. 3 days to convince 22 hardened miners to abandon the richest strike most of them had ever seen. 3 days to prevent a massacre that would accomplish nothing except adding more graves to the frontier's bloody toll. He closed his journal and began the long walk back to base camp, his mind already working on arguments that might persuade men whose dreams of wealth had finally seemed within reach. Behind him, the afternoon shadows lengthened across the canyon floor, and somewhere among the watching rocks, Henrik felt sure that Ayana was observing his every move. That evening, Henrik called a meeting of the expedition members. Gathered around their central campfire, the 23 men presented a formidable group. Experienced miners, tough frontier veterans, men who had fought Indians, claim jumpers, and the elements to scratch a living from some of the world's most challenging terrain. I've been approached by representatives of the local tribe, Henrik began, choosing his words carefully. They consider this canyon to be sacred ground and want us to leave. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Several men reached for weapons, others began cursing, and Collins stood up with his face flushed with anger. I knew this was coming, Collins said loudly. Indians always try to scare off miners with talk of sacred ground and spirit curses. It's just an excuse to keep the white man from developing the land. Maybe, Henrik replied calmly. But I've seen signs of significant Indian activity in these mountains. We're outnumbered and a long way from help. If it comes to fighting, we'll lose. You sound like you're ready to run at the first sign of Indian trouble, sneered Jameson, a large man with a reputation for violence. Maybe you're not cut out for frontier mining. Henrik felt heat rise in his cheeks, but kept his voice level. I'm not afraid of reasonable risks, but I don't see any point in getting killed over silver that won't do us any good if we're dead. The boy's got a point, said MacDonald, one of the older miners. We're pretty exposed out here. If the Indians decide they want us gone, they can make it happen. This triggered a fierce debate that lasted well into the night. Some men agreed with Henrik that discretion was the better part of valor. Others, led by Collins and Jameson, argued for standing their ground and fighting if necessary. A few suggested compromise positions, such as hiring Indian guides or offering tribute to the local tribes. Through it all, Henrik found his thoughts returning to Ayana. The memory of her presence, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet strength she projected even in conversation with a potential enemy. She was unlike any woman he had ever met, Indian or white, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she represented something important, something he didn't fully understand. The meeting ended without resolution, though it was clear that the group was divided. Collins made it plain that he intended to continue mining regardless of Indian objections, and several men declared their intention to follow his lead. Others seemed inclined to pack up and leave, while a few remained undecided. The next morning brought troubling news. 2 of the men on guard duty reported seeing Indian signals during the night, smoke signals from distant peaks, and what appeared to be mirror flashes in the early dawn light. The canyon was definitely being watched, and word of the mining operation was being spread among the local tribes. Henrik spent the day working his claim, but his heart wasn't in it. The rich silver ore that had excited him only days before now seemed like a curse, valuable enough to die for, but not valuable enough to justify the potential cost in human life. As afternoon shadows lengthened, he found himself scanning the canyon rim, hoping to see Ayana again. She appeared just as the sun was setting, emerging from concealment near the same spot where Henrik had first glimpsed her. This time, she approached openly, walking down the canyon wall with the confidence of someone moving through her own territory. Henrik met her halfway, aware that every man in the camp was watching this unprecedented encounter. Up close, Ayana was even more formidable than he remembered. Tall, powerful, radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from absolute confidence in one's abilities. "Your men decide?" she asked without preamble. Henrik shook his head. "They're divided. Some want to leave, others want to stay and fight." Ayana's expression didn't change, but Henrik sensed disappointment. "Fighting brings only death. Your men should understand this." "Some do," Henrik replied. "But others see the silver as their one chance for real wealth. They're not going to give it up easily." "Wealth means nothing to dead men," Ayana observed pragmatically. Henrik couldn't argue with that logic. "What happens now?" "Tomorrow, final chance," Ayana replied. "My war chief loses patience with white men who ignore warnings. After tomorrow, warriors come down from mountains." The threat was clear, but Henrik sensed something else in her manner, a reluctance that suggested she took no pleasure in the prospect of violence. "Is there no other way?" he asked. "No compromise that might satisfy both sides?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before. "You are a strange white man," she said. "Most of your people see only what they want from our lands. You see more." "I try to understand," Henrik replied simply. "Understanding is a rare gift," Ayana acknowledged. "But understanding alone does not solve all problems." She moved closer to him, and Henrik caught the scent of sage and wood smoke that seemed to cling to her buckskin clothing. Standing this close to her, he was acutely aware of her size and strength, but also of the intelligence and compassion he could see in her features. "There is one possibility," she said finally, her voice so low that only Henrik could hear, "but it would require great trust between your people and mine." "What kind of possibility?" Ayana glanced toward the base camp, where several miners were watching their conversation with obvious suspicion. "Not here." Too many ears, too much fear. "Tomorrow, if you truly want to understand, come to sacred place above canyon. Come alone." The invitation was clearly dangerous. Meeting an unknown number of Indians in isolated territory was exactly the kind of risk that got frontier settlers killed. But something in Ayana's manner convinced Henrik that this was a genuine offer of communication rather than a trap. "Where?" he asked. "Follow stream to canyon head. Look for eagle painted on red rock. Trail leads up from there." She fixed him with her penetrating stare. "Come with respect, not fear. Bring no weapons." Henrik nodded, understanding, though privately he wondered if he was making a fatal mistake. "I'll be there." Ayana studied him for another moment, then unexpectedly extended her hand. When Henrik took it, he was struck by the strength of her grip and the callous texture of her palm, evidence of a life spent in physical labor. "You have courage, small miner," she said, using what he was beginning to recognize as her term of address for him. "Tomorrow we see if you also have wisdom." With that, she turned and walked back toward the canyon wall, disappearing into the gathering darkness with the same fluid grace she had displayed before. Henrik stood watching the spot where she had vanished, acutely aware that his life had just taken another dramatic turn. When he returned to the base camp, Collins and several others immediately bombarded him with questions about the encounter. Henrik answered truthfully but minimally, explaining that he had been invited to a meeting that might result in a peaceful resolution to their situation. "It's a trap," Jameson declared immediately. "Indians don't negotiate, they just kill from ambush." "Maybe," Henrik acknowledged. "But if there's any chance of avoiding a fight, I think it's worth the risk." Collins shook his head in disgust. "You're going to get yourself killed for nothing, boy." Indians respect only strength, not talk. Despite the universal disapproval of his fellow miners, Henrik was determined to keep the appointment with Ayanna. He spent a restless night contemplating the various ways the meeting could go wrong, but also thinking about the tall Indian woman who seemed to offer the possibility of understanding across cultural boundaries that were usually insurmountable. The next morning, Henrik set out early for the canyon head, following the stream as Ayanna had instructed. The painted eagle was exactly where she had said it would be, a stylized bird figure in red ochre on a prominent rock face, clearly marking a trail that led up the canyon's eastern wall. The climb was challenging, following a narrow path that switched back and forth up the steep slope. Henrik's mining experience served him well in navigating the treacherous terrain, though he was breathing hard by the time he reached what appeared to be a natural platform about halfway up the canyon wall. The platform opened onto a hidden valley that took his breath away. Perhaps half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide, it was like a secret garden tucked into the mountains, with lush grass, scattered groves of aspen and pine, and a small lake fed by springs that bubbled up from the valley floor. But most impressive were the people gathered to meet him. There were perhaps 30 Indians arranged in a rough semicircle near the lake's edge, most of them warriors, but including several women and elderly men who were clearly tribal leaders. At the center of the group, seated on a blanket spread on the grass, was an ancient man whose weathered face and intelligent eyes suggested great wisdom and authority. Ayanna stood beside the old man, her tall form imposing even in this gathering of her own people. When she saw Henrik approaching, she gestured for him to join them on the grass. "You came," she said simply, and Henrik thought he detected relief in her voice. "I said I would," Henrik replied, settling cross-legged on the blanket in the manner he had observed among the Indians. The old man studied Henrik with eyes that seemed to see everything. When he spoke, it was in accented but clear English, his voice carrying the authority of long leadership. "I am Mountain Eagle," he said, "war chief of the Elkhorn Band, keeper of the sacred places in these mountains." Henrik inclined his head respectfully. "I'm honored to meet you, sir. I'm Henrik Larson." "Ayanna tells me you are different from other whites," Mountain Eagle continued, "that you seek understanding rather than just silver." "I try to understand," Henrik replied carefully. "I know I'm an outsider here, but I respect your connection to this land." Mountain Eagle nodded slowly. "Respect is good beginning, but more is needed." He gestured toward the hidden valley around them. "This place has been sacred to my people for 10 generations. Here our young men come to seek visions. Here our medicine men speak with spirits of earth and sky." Henrik looked around the valley with new understanding. Even from a geological perspective, it was unusual, a perfect natural amphitheater carved from the surrounding peaks, with mineral springs and rock formations that suggested significant underground thermal activity. It was exactly the kind of place that would seem spiritually significant to people who lived in close harmony with natural forces. "The canyon below," Mountain Eagle continued, "is gateway to this sacred place. Silver veins your people dig are spirit paths, connecting sacred earth to sacred sky. When you disturb them, you break connection that has existed since world began. Henrik nodded, beginning to understand the magnitude of what the mining expedition had stumbled into. They weren't just digging up ore. They were, from the Indian perspective, destroying something equivalent to a cathedral. "I begin to understand," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry. We didn't know." "Not knowing does not repair damage," observed an elderly woman seated near Mountain Eagle. "But understanding might prevent more damage." This seemed to be the opening Ayanna had hinted at. Henrik leaned forward slightly, trying to project sincerity and respect. "What would it take to repair the damage?" he asked. "And what would it take to ensure it doesn't happen again?" The Indians exchanged glances, clearly having discussed this possibility in advance. Mountain Eagle spoke after a moment of consultation with his advisors. "Damage to spirit paths is severe," he said gravely, "but not beyond repair if proper ceremonies are performed, proper offerings made to angry spirits." "What kind of ceremonies?" Henrik asked. "Sacred silver must be returned to earth," Ayanna interjected. "Not all, but enough to show respect, to acknowledge connection between your people and spirit world." Henrik's heart sank. The miners had already extracted significant amounts of ore, and convincing them to give any of it back would be nearly impossible. But he pushed on, hoping to find some workable compromise. "How much silver?" he asked. Mountain Eagle consulted with the elderly woman, then replied, "1 part in 4 of what has been taken, and promised that no more will be taken from sacred veins." It was actually a reasonable proposal from the Indian perspective, Henrik realized. They were asking for 1/4 of the extracted silver as a gesture of respect, plus an end to mining activity in the spiritually sensitive areas. The remaining 3/4 would still represent significant wealth for the expedition members. "There are other veins," Henrik said carefully, thinking of his geological observations. "Less rich, but still valuable. Areas that might not be as sacred to your people. Possible," Mountain Eagle acknowledged, "but would require careful discussion, proper agreements between peoples." This was the compromise Ayanna had hinted at: limited mining rights in exchange for respect for sacred areas and proper compensation to the tribe. It wasn't perfect from anyone's perspective, but it offered the possibility of coexistence rather than conflict. "I'll take your proposal back to my men," Henrik promised. "I can't guarantee they'll accept it, but I'll do my best to make them understand." "Understanding is difficult for men blinded by silver dreams," observed the elderly woman dryly. Henrik had to acknowledge the truth of that statement. Getting Collins and the others to give up 1/4 of their expected wealth, plus agree to limited mining rights, would require considerable persuasion. But it was better than the alternative of total war. As the formal meeting concluded, Ayanna approached Henrik as he prepared to begin his descent back to the canyon. "You spoke well," she said, her voice warm with approval, "like man who thinks with both head and heart." "I hope it's enough," Henrik replied. "My people can be as stubborn as yours when it comes to matters of principle." "Stubbornness is not always bad quality," Ayanna observed with what might have been humor, "but must be balanced with wisdom." She walked with him to the beginning of the trail, and Henrik found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him. In the context of her own people, surrounded by the beauty of the sacred valley, she seemed even more magnificent than before. "Ayanna," he said as they reached the trailhead, then paused, unsure how to express what he was feeling. She turned to face him, her dark eyes questioning. Standing this close to her, with the afternoon sun highlighting the strong lines of her face, Henrik felt something shift inside him, a recognition of connection that transcended the cultural boundaries that should have made understanding impossible. "Thank you," he said finally, "for trusting me enough to arrange this meeting, for believing that peace might be possible." "Trust must be earned," Ayanna replied, but her tone was gentle. "You begin to earn it, small miner." On impulse, Henrik extended his hand as she had done the previous evening. When Ayanna took it, he felt that same electric contact, the strength of her grip and the unexpected gentleness of her touch. "Will I see you again?" he asked, the words emerging before he could stop them. Ayanna studied his face with that penetrating stare, as if trying to read his intentions. "That depends on how your men receive Mountain Eagle's offer," she said finally, "and on whether you truly seek understanding or only silver." "I seek understanding," Henrik said with complete honesty. "I've found something here worth more than any amount of silver." For a moment, something flickered in Ayanna's eyes, an acknowledgement of the connection he felt growing between them. Then she stepped back, professional distance reasserting itself. "Go now," she said. "Speak truth words to your men. Tomorrow we will know if peace or war comes to these mountains." The descent to the canyon floor seemed longer than the climb up, Henrik's mind occupied with the challenge ahead. Convincing 22 hardened miners to give up a quarter of their expected wealth would require every ounce of persuasion he possessed. But the alternative, a war that would likely end with all of them dead, made the attempt worthwhile. He found the camp in an uproar when he returned. During his absence, 2 more men had reported Indian sightings, and Collins had organized armed patrols to secure the perimeter. The mood was tense, fearful, and increasingly hostile toward anything that smacked of accommodation with the local tribes. "There he is," Collins announced as Henrik entered the camp. "Our Indian negotiator. Hope you had a pleasant chat with your savage friends." Henrik ignored the sarcasm and called for another meeting. As the men gathered around the central fire, he could see suspicion and anger in many faces. These were men who had come west to escape the limitations of civilized society, men who believed that strength and determination could overcome any obstacle. The idea of compromise with Indians ran against everything they had been taught to believe. "I've met with the local tribal leaders," Henrik began without preamble. "They're willing to negotiate." "Negotiate what?" Jameson demanded. "This is American territory now. Indians don't have any legal claim to it." "Legal or not, they're here in force," Henrik replied calmly. "And we're vastly outnumbered, but they're offering us a way to avoid bloodshed while still benefiting from the silver deposits." He outlined Mountain Eagle's proposal as clearly as he could. Return 1/4 of the extracted ore as a gesture of respect. Cease mining in the most sacred areas, but continue operations in other parts of the canyon under a negotiated agreement with the tribe. The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. "Give back 1/4 of our silver?" Collins exploded. "To a bunch of savages who have no legal right to it? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "It's better than losing all of it," Henrik countered, "along with our lives." "Maybe for a coward," Jameson sneered. "But some of us came west to fight for what's ours, not to hand it over to the first Indian who makes threats." McDonald, one of the older miners, raised a voice of caution. "The boy might have a point. We are pretty exposed out here, and if the Indians are serious about fighting—" "Indians are always serious about fighting," Collins interrupted. "But they respect strength. Show them we're not afraid, and they'll back down." The debate raged for hours, with Henrik finding himself increasingly isolated in his advocacy for peaceful resolution. Most of the men seemed to view any compromise as weakness, any accommodation as surrender. The rich silver veins they had worked so hard to develop represented their dreams of financial independence, and they weren't willing to sacrifice those dreams for Indian sensibilities. As the meeting broke up without resolution, Henrik felt a growing sense of doom. These men were determined to fight rather than compromise, and their determination was going to get them all killed. That night, he lay awake staring at the stars and thinking about Ayanna. The memory of her presence, her intelligence, her quiet strength, filled him with a longing he hadn't expected. In the space of a few conversations, she'd become more real to him than any woman he had ever known. The thought that the coming conflict might make further contact impossible was almost unbearable. Dawn brought troubling developments. The guards reported that their horses had been driven off during the night, scattered across miles of mountain terrain that would take days to search. More ominously, several mining tools had disappeared from their storage area, and the men's personal weapons had been moved from where they had been left the previous evening. The message was clear. The Indians could strike at will, taking what they wanted and going where they pleased. The miners were completely at their mercy, though Collins and his supporters seemed determined not to acknowledge this reality. "It's just harassment," Collins declared as the men gathered for breakfast. "Trying to scare us into running? Well, it won't work." But Henrik could see fear in the faces around the fire, the growing realization that they were facing an enemy who could strike without warning and disappear without trace. Several men began talking quietly about abandoning the claims and heading back to civilization while they still could. It was mid-morning when Ayanna appeared again, walking openly down the canyon wall with the same confident stride Henrik remembered. This time, however, she was not alone. Behind her came a dozen warriors, all heavily armed and painted for war. The effect on the mining camp was electric. Men scrambled for weapons, shouted orders, prepared for the fight they had been anticipating. But Ayanna raised her hand in a gesture of parley, and the warriors remained at a distance while she approached the camp alone. Henrik met her at the perimeter, aware that every eye in the camp was fixed on their interaction. "Your men decide?" she asked, without preamble. Henrik shook his head regretfully. "Most want to fight rather than negotiate. They don't believe Indians have any right to make demands." Ayanna's expression didn't change, but Henrik sensed disappointment and perhaps sadness. "Then warriors will come tomorrow at sunrise. All who remain in Sacred Canyon will die." The finality of her words sent a chill through Henrik. "All of them?" "My war chief has lost patience with white men who ignore wisdom," Ayanna replied. "No more warnings, no more chances for peace." Henrik looked back toward the camp where his fellow miners were watching with barely concealed hostility. 22 men who had come west seeking fortune and would instead find death because they couldn't see beyond their own greed and prejudice. "What about me?" Henrik asked quietly. "Do I die with them?" Ayanna studied his face with that penetrating stare he had come to know. "You spoke for peace. You sought understanding. Mountain Eagle remembers this." She paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. When she spoke again, her voice was so low that only Henrik could hear. "Come to Sacred Valley tonight. Alone. Leave weapons. Leave silver. Leave everything that connects you to other white men." The invitation was clear in its implications. Henrik could save his life by abandoning his companions, by choosing the Indian side in the coming conflict. It was a reasonable offer under the circumstances, but it felt like betrayal of the men who had trusted him to represent their interests. "I can't abandon them," he said finally. "Even if they won't listen to reason, I can't just run away and let them die." Something flickered in Ayanna's eyes, an emotion Henrik couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a quality she valued. "You would die for men who call you coward?" she asked. "Not for them," Henrik replied honestly. "For the principle. For the idea that people should be able to find ways to resolve their differences without killing each other." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from Henrik to the camp and back again. The warriors behind her waited with patient discipline, but Henrik could sense their readiness for violence. "There is one other way," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "But it would require great courage from small miner." "What way?" "Trial by combat, ancient custom, recognized by all tribes in these mountains." She fixed him with her intense stare. "One warrior from each side fights alone. Winners' people claim victory. Losers' people accept judgment." Henrik's heart skipped a beat. Single combat was a concept from medieval legends, not something he had expected to encounter in the American wilderness. But if it could prevent a massacre, "Who would fight for your people?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I would," Ayanna replied simply. "I am war leader's granddaughter, proven warrior, accepted champion for my people." Henrik looked up at her towering form, her obvious strength and combat experience, then down at his own slight frame. The mismatch was almost comical, like a child challenging an adult. And if I agreed to this combat, what would the terms be? Fight until one yields or dies, Ayanna replied matter-of-factly. Winners' people claim Canyon, losers' people leave forever, or face war. It was insane. Henrik had never fought anyone seriously in his entire life, let alone a trained warrior who could probably break him in half with her bare hands. But it was also the only alternative to a massacre that would accomplish nothing except adding more graves to the frontier's bloody toll. I need to discuss this with my men, Henrik said finally. Ayanna nodded. Sunset. Give answer then. She turned and walked back toward her waiting warriors, leaving Henrik to contemplate what might be the most important decision of his life. The reaction in the mining camp was mixed when Henrik explained the offer of single combat. Some men saw it as their salvation, a chance to avoid hopeless battle against overwhelming odds. Others viewed it as another form of cowardice, a betrayal of American principles. You can't fight that Amazon, Collins protested. She'll kill you in minutes, and then we'll be right back where we started. Maybe, Henrik acknowledged, but at least it gives us a chance. And it prevents 22 men from dying for nothing. There's got to be another way, MacDonald said desperately. Some kind of compromise we haven't thought of. Henrik shook his head. I've tried everything I can think of. This is our last option. The debate continued through the afternoon, but gradually a consensus emerged. Faced with certain death in conventional battle, even the most belligerent miners began to see single combat as their best hope for survival. If Henrik could somehow win against impossible odds, they would keep their claims and their silver. If he lost, they would at least have time to escape with their lives. As sunset approached, Henrik found himself strangely calm. The decision had been made, and there was a certain peace in no longer having to contemplate alternatives. Tomorrow morning, he would face Ayanna in combat that would determine the fate of everyone in the canyon. She appeared precisely at sunset, walking alone down the canyon wall to receive his answer. Henrik met her at the same spot where they had talked before, aware that this might be their final conversation. I accept, he said simply. Ayanna nodded, showing no surprise. Combat begins at sunrise, sacred valley where mountain eagle and tribal elders can witness. What weapons? Henrik asked. No weapons. Hand to hand only. Ancient way, pure test of strength and spirit. Henrik's heart sank. Without weapons, his slight size and lack of fighting experience put him at even greater disadvantage, but he had committed himself to this course, and there was no backing out now. Is there anything else I should know about the rules? Ayanna hesitated, then stepped closer to him. In the fading light, her strong features seemed almost gentle. Combat ends when one fighter yields or cannot continue, she said carefully. Yielding brings no shame if fighter has shown courage. The implication was clear. She was giving him an honorable way out, a chance to surrender without losing face completely. It was a kindness he hadn't expected from someone who would be trying to kill him in a few hours. Thank you, he said quietly. For everything. For trying to find peaceful solutions. For showing me that understanding is possible between different peoples. You are good man. Henrik Larsson. Ayanna replied, using his full name for the first time. Different from other whites. In different world we might have been friends. In a different world, Henrik agreed, we might have been much more than friends. The words hung between them, acknowledging the connection they both felt but could never fully explore. Ayanna's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment the warrior mask slipped, revealing something vulnerable and entirely human. Then she stepped back, professional distance reasserting itself. Sunrise, she said firmly. Come alone to Sacred Valley. As she disappeared into the gathering darkness, Henrik stood looking up at the stars and wondering if he would see another sunset. The smart thing would be to slip away during the night, to abandon his foolish companions and save his own life. But he had given his word, and some principles were worth dying for. Behind him, the mining camp settled into an uneasy quiet. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or disaster, depending on the outcome of a fight between the smallest man in the expedition and the most formidable warrior in the territory. The odds were impossible, but sometimes impossible things happened. Henrik thought again of Ayana's dark eyes, her quiet strength, the intelligence and compassion he had glimpsed beneath her warrior exterior. If he had to face death tomorrow, at least it would be at the hands of someone he respected, someone who had shown him possibilities he had never imagined. The night was long and filled with strange dreams, but when dawn came, Henrik Larsson was ready to meet his fate in the hidden valley above the canyon, where sacred springs bubbled up from the earth and ancient spirits watched the endless dance of human ambition and human folly. Henrik stood at the edge of the canyon, the fading light of dusk painting the cliffs in molten gold and crimson. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and pine from the high ridges, a fragrance that seemed older than the world itself, ancient and enduring. He thought of the silver veins glinting in the canyon walls, a lure for the hearts of men like his companions, and of the sacred valley beyond, a place of power and mystery guarded fiercely by Ayana and her people.
"Sacred silver must be returned to the earth,"
Ayana had said, her voice cutting through the hush of the meeting like a blade. "Not all, but enough to show respect, to acknowledge the connection between your people and the spirit world." Henrik had felt the weight of that demand immediately. The miners had already taken more than their fair share, and asking them to surrender a quarter of their wealth was no small matter. But he could not ignore the wisdom in her words, the dignity behind her insistence. "How much silver?" he had asked cautiously. Mountain Eagle had conferred briefly with the elderly woman at his side, their conversation an intricate dance of nods and murmurs. "1 part in 4 of what has been taken," the chief finally said, "and promise that no more will be taken from sacred veins." It was a compromise, Henrik realized, a test of honor, more than a negotiation of wealth. 1/4 of the silver returned, sacred veins left untouched, and the remainder available for his men. Reasonable, in the eyes of those who understood the deeper world, the one in which respect and balance mattered as much as profit. "There are other veins," Henrik had suggested, thinking of his geological observations, less rich, but still valuable. "Areas that might not be sacred to your people." "Possible," Mountain Eagle had replied, "but would require careful discussion, proper agreements between peoples." Henrik recognized the subtle wisdom in that response. There was no hasty decision here, no brash claim to dominion. There was care, negotiation, and a recognition that coexistence demanded both patience and humility. Returning to his men, Henrik had faced a storm of skepticism and hostility. Collins had greeted him with sarcasm and thinly veiled contempt. Jameson had insisted that legality and rights lay on the side of the white men, while MacDonald had cautiously urged caution. But most voices had been raised in anger. Greed, fear, and the raw lust for silver clouded every attempt at reason. Henrik had presented the proposal carefully, emphasizing survival over wealth, reason over prejudice. And yet, as the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, he could see the rift widening between his convictions and their obstinacy. The miners were willing to gamble their lives for silver, unwilling to consider the wisdom of compromise. That night, sleep came fitfully. Henrik lay on his cot beneath the vast canopy of stars, the darkness punctuated by the occasional distant cry of a coyote. Dreams swirled in his mind. Visions of silver veins turning to blood, of the sacred valley consumed in fire and vengeance. And always, there was Ayana, her dark eyes luminous in the dream-shadowed night, her presence both frightening and comforting, a constant reminder of the choices before him. Dawn brought unsettling news. Horses had vanished, scattered across the rugged terrain, and tools had been moved, signaling the power and reach of the tribe. The miners' bravado faltered, their confidence shaken, yet their stubbornness remained. Collins insisted it was mere harassment, but Henrik saw the truth. They were vulnerable, completely at the mercy of a foe whose understanding of the land and its spirits far surpassed their own. Ayanna appeared again, descending the canyon wall with deliberate ease, a dozen warriors behind her, painted and armed for battle. The miners scrambled for weapons, hearts pounding with fear and anticipation, but Ayanna raised a hand. Her warriors stayed, disciplined and silent, as she approached Henrik alone. "Your men decide?" she asked, voice calm, unyielding. Henrik shook his head. "Most want to fight rather than negotiate. They don't believe Indians have any right to make demands." Her eyes, dark and unflinching, seemed to pierce into his very thoughts. "Then warriors will come tomorrow at sunrise. All who remain in Sacred Canyon will die." Henrik felt the weight of inevitability settle over him. The canyon would become a tomb unless some impossible solution could be found. "What about me?" he asked softly. "You spoke for peace," she replied. "You sought understanding." Mountain Eagle remembers this. A choice presented itself: abandon his companions to save his own life, or seek an almost impossible path that might avert bloodshed. And then, the improbable solution: single combat, an ancient custom, a trial of strength and spirit, where the fate of many could hinge on the courage and skill of one. Ayanna herself would be his opponent, a warrior trained for a lifetime, her strength, skill, and discipline evident in every line of her body. Henrik, a miner, a man of modest build and little combat experience, felt the enormity of the challenge like a physical weight pressing on his chest. Yet he recognized the only path to survival and the only path to honor. He agreed. Weapons would be forbidden, hand-to-hand combat only, a pure test of courage and spirit. Henrik's heart sank at the thought, but Ayanna's tone, the faintest hint of kindness beneath her warrior exterior, offered a measure of grace. Yielding was permitted without shame if courage had been shown, a subtle promise of dignity even in defeat. That night he walked under the stars, preparing himself. Memories of Ayanna's warmth, her intelligence, her patience, and her strength filled him with resolve. He could not control the outcome, but he could control his courage. Sunrise found him in the sacred valley, surrounded by the whisper of springs and the ancient presence of spirits. Mountain Eagle and the elders watched, silent and solemn. Ayanna stepped forward, her presence commanding, her gaze unwavering. Henrik met her eyes. There was fear, yes, but also an unshakable recognition of the gravity of the moment, the dignity of the ancient custom, and the fragile possibility that understanding, even in a world so often driven by greed and blood, could prevail. The first movements were cautious, exploratory, a dance of instincts and reflexes. Henrik struggled to anticipate her strength, her speed, the precision of her attacks. Each blow he blocked, each feint he attempted, tested every ounce of his resolve. Pain blossomed in his muscles, sweat stung his eyes, and yet he endured, drawing upon a determination forged in the crucible of principle and survival. Time seemed to stretch. The sun rose higher, casting shadows across the valley floor. Neither gave quarter. The battle became not merely physical, but a test of endurance, strategy, and spirit. Henrik began to understand the rhythm of Ayanna's movements, the subtle patterns in her attacks, the moments where hesitation or overconfidence could tip the balance. Hours passed, breath came ragged, bodies slick with sweat and dirt. And then, through some combination of luck, instinct, and willpower, Henrik found an opening, a brief, fleeting advantage. He seized it with every ounce of strength he possessed, holding Ayanna in a grappling lock that tested her endurance as much as his own. It was not victory born of skill alone, but of determination, courage, and the desire to protect lives beyond his own. Ayanna yielded, a quiet acknowledgment of his courage, and Henrik, exhausted and battered, rose unscathed. Silence fell over the valley, Mountain Eagle and the elders nodded in solemn approval. The warriors behind Ayanna lowered their weapons. Henrik's men, watching from the canyon rim, felt awe and relief in equal measure. The trial had ended without a massacre. Lives were spared, and respect had been earned on both sides. Henrik collapsed to his knees, gasping, his body shaking from exertion and relief. Ayanna approached him, her expression unreadable, but her hand extended. He took it, a silent bond forged in sweat, courage, and shared humanity. "Your people will honor the agreement," she said, voice steady but not unkind. "Return what is sacred, and the rest of the canyon may be worked under guidance. Balance must be maintained." Henrik nodded, understanding the truth of her words. The silver, the wealth, the ambitions, they were secondary to life, respect, and the possibility of coexistence. In the days that followed, the miners complied, returning the sacred portion of their silver and ceasing work in the revered areas. Agreements were drawn, boundaries respected, and for the first time, a measure of peace settled over the canyon. Henrik and Ayanna maintained a wary but genuine respect, an understanding born of shared trial and mutual recognition of courage and principle. And sometimes, in quiet moments beneath the stars or along the ridges of the canyon, Henrik would remember the strength of her eyes, the steadiness of her hand, and the way she had shown him that even in a world driven by greed and conflict, honor, understanding, and courage could still carve out a place for peace. The silver would glint in the sunlight, the miners would toil, and the sacred valley would endure. But Henrik knew that he had glimpsed something far more precious than any vein of ore, a connection between peoples, a bridge between worlds, and a test of character that he would carry forever.